Good morning, honourable members. Let us pray. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideals, but laying aside all private interests and prejudices, keep in mind the responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. Please be seated. Orders of the day.
Committee of the Whole.
Members, I'd like to call Committee of the Whole to order. Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 21, the Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2022. This is its first time in Committee of the Whole. Are there members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity. So, as we've discussed during the second reading of this bill, there's a number of aspects of the bill that we are indeed in agreement with. The majority of these changes that are being proposed in this bill are really administrative, and we agree with a lot of them. However, there are some, and I would say one in particular, that we're a little bit, I would say a lot, in disagreement with. And of course, that is the one aspect of the bill which basically gives a Minister of Environment such widespread powers over parks. And given the track record of this UCP government, it's very hard for us to just assume that everything will be all right with such, with the kind of power that is being allotted to the Minister of Environment when it comes to this particular file. What we've seen so far when it comes to environment and parks here in the province of Alberta is this government trying to basically sell off parts of our provincial park system. And of course, Albertans came out very strongly against the mining of the eastern slopes. I would say it was quite the boondoggle for this UCP government. People from all over the province, no matter where, were in complete disagreement to this proposal by the UCP, which they didn't even bring into the legislature for us to really debate. There was no opportunity for feedback from the opposition as they moved in this particular direction. And we had no other choice but then to support the majority of Albertans who were all saying that they did not want the mining of the eastern slopes for coal. And I'm glad that they did, and I'm glad that they came out in such force to actually demonstrate that this was not their will and that they were against this particular proposal by this UCP government. And therefore, when it comes to this particular issue, it leaves us all imagining the worst because of the track record already established by this UCP government that demonstrates to us that they cannot be trusted. And it's Albertans themselves that are saying that this UCP government can't be trusted when it comes to this particular file, and many others, I would say. And just to be absolutely clear, I'd actually like to quote from the bill. In the bill, under Minister's Directives and Codes, it says, "The Minister may set standards, directives, practices, codes, guidelines, or other rules relating to any matter in respect of which a regulation may be made under this Act." And that can only be interpreted as the Minister being able to do absolutely anything the Minister wants when it comes to this. So here we have a omnibus piece of legislation that is sneaking this one particular proposal in, and they've Albertans have already spoke widely against anything that this government would propose with the actual mining of the eastern slopes. And I do believe that it's a point of contention that basically Albertans don't trust this government, because essentially, what kind of powers are we talking about, Madam Chair, when it comes to the powers being allocated to the Minister of Environment on this particular file? Well, it could be, for example, it could perhaps be the power to partially privatize the park. Perhaps it's for restricting access to parks. As we've already seen, this government has what they've done with Kananaskis, where Albertans, a very common summer destination for many families, and I would add many low-income families, which is they don't have the opportunity to travel abroad. And Kananaskis was a summer destination for so many people, one that they could just simply drive to, if they had access to a car, that is, and actually enjoy the mountains here in the province of Alberta. And now this government has decided that, well, if you're going to be able to enjoy these mountains, you're going to have to pay a fee to get in. So we're seeing more and more of this government making decisions that are actually restricting Albertans. And we can't be certain that the minister won't do more of this if he's given these widespread powers, as has been determined in this particular piece of legislation. So it leaves us on this side of the House very worried that the powers won't be used wisely or with all Albertans in mind. And frankly, I would say that I find it unfathomable that this government would actually do that, restrict access. Now, I understand that, some of the individuals on the other side of the House, to them it's be like, oh, well, you just pay this small fee. Well, maybe, the members on the other side of the House, they interact with individuals that, yeah, a small fee, what to them is a small fee, for others is not accessible. And that's why it's important that all Albertans be considered when this actually takes place. And I think that it's imperative on this government, being elected into office, to actually represent all Albertans, that they would actually consider this. Now, first of all, it could be with Kananaskis, but then it could be with other provincial parks all throughout Alberta that they would begin starting to charge a fee. We've seen, in order to hold a campsite, for example, they're adding a fee. And, I understand that it's with the intention behind it was so that people wouldn't hold a website or a campsite, and then later on not use it. But this also restricts access to people that may not have the financial ability to actually pay for it, right? They also want to be able to enjoy Alberta's parks. It's one of the few options that they do have when it comes to vacationing in the province of Alberta. So this, in fact, is an economic barrier. And I completely understand. Some members on the other side of the House, or perhaps all the members on the other House, for them, they see it as just a small fee. But as I was saying, Madam Chair, what some people consider a small fee may, to others, is an economic barrier. They'll have to make another decision or go somewhere else. When they're used to going to Kananaskis, they would then have to consider going somewhere else. But I think that what's most challenging about this particular aspect is that it just gives such incredible amount of power to the Minister of Environment. Now, I've spoken at length, Madam Chair, about ministers, more power being put into the hands of ministers during this government. I couldn't put an exact number on it, but I would say, over definitely more than half the bills that have been presented inside of this House during this government's tenure have been putting more power in the hands of ministers. And that can only be seen, like if it was one bill, okay, perhaps understandable. But then when it becomes 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 bills, all with particular changes made that actually put more power into the hands of ministers, you have to start asking yourself, why is this government so power hungry? A lot of these decisions were made by agencies, boards, and commissions prior to this government coming into power, where Albertans had an opportunity to participate in the decision-making process of different aspects of what actually the business conducted by this government here in the province of Alberta. People were actually aiding. There were councils where debates were had, people had discussion on particular aspects, and together they would reach a decision, and then they would make the recommendation to the minister to actually make a particular change. But now what we're seeing with this government is that they're taking away those powers from agencies, boards, and commissions. So taking power out of the hands of Albertans that are actually participating in a democratic process, and they're putting that power into the hands of the minister. And for me, it just begs the question, the members on the other side, they like to talk a lot about freedom. They like to talk a lot about small government. And that, and this bill is a testament of their perspective on trying to curb red tape. But yet in the same bill, which according to them, they're proposing more freedoms, less regulation, less red tape, they go and they put the power in the hands of a minister, where there is no accountability. And this coming from a political party that likes to yell about accountability all the time. Many of the members that are private members of the government caucus on the other side, when they were in opposition, members of the Wild Rose would talk about accountability endlessly in this House, that the government had to be held accountable. And yet now those same members are on that side of the House supporting bills that actually create an environment of less accountability when it comes to the powers that this government wields through each of their ministers. So it's highly questionable. You can't be speaking out of both sides of your mouth, Madam Chair. You're either for accountability or you're not. You can't, there's no other word to describe that than hypocritical and flip-flopping on an issue. And I think that Albertans have demonstrated, and as we've seen through last week, they're very much wanting to hold those in power accountable. And I think that the members on the other side of the House have to listen carefully, listen very, very carefully when it comes to the desire of Albertans and the fact that they want to hold their government accountable. And this is a step in the wrong direction when it comes to this proposed piece of legislation. It's definitely a step in the wrong direction. Giving this amount of power over to a minister is not what Albertans have in mind when it comes to strengthening their democracy. Albertans want to have more say in the democratic decision-making process, not less. The way that things stand right now is like we saw this happen a couple of weeks ago when the government decided to take away insulin pumps from Albertans. And there were a number of examples where this government took away insulin pumps from children that depend on those insulin pumps to actually go to school. And yes, I understand that they were proposing an alternative, but that alternative had not been put in place yet. So these individuals felt that they were being left hanging, hung out to dry, Madam Chair. A more appropriate and more effective way of moving forward would have been to move from one program to another if that is indeed what this government wanted to do. But it didn't have a solution to a problem. It was actually creating a problem for Albertans. And I, for one, am so happy that those Albertans decided to come together. From my understanding, I believe it was more than 13,000 emails and letters that were actually sent to the Minister of Health to demand that he not end this program of insulin pumps. And there's been multiple examples of this kind of decision-making by this government that actually negatively impacts Albertans. And by putting more power into the hands of ministers, you can bet that you're going to see that. Consulting with a handful of people is not the same thing with consulting on a broad scale with the people of Alberta. It's very easy to go out and be like, oh, well, I consulted with a handful of people. That's what is not being divulged. Yeah, you can go out and like ask a handful of people and be like, oh yes, I consulted. But that's not the appropriate way to consult. A lot of the people that wrote in those letters regarding the insulin pump stated that they were not consulted. Advocacy groups representing these individuals said that they weren't consulted. So then it begs the question, then who did this government actually consult to make this decision? And this is becoming more and more of a problem with this government, Madam Chair, where they say they've consulted with certain people, but yet the decisions that they're making are having drastic and negative impacts on Albertans. And I find it just incredible that they would take away a program that was actually helping children go to school. You take away their insulin pump, and then what happens then? And not just children, but a number of Albertans. And so I can only imagine, Madam Chair, that by putting more and more power into the hands of ministers and not devising an appropriate way of actually consulting, then the government's going to end up running into more instances where they're going to have to backpedal on decisions that they're making. Because there's no process where they're actually consulting with a wide group of Albertans when it comes to particular issues. And I can only imagine that the same thing that happened with strip mining of the eastern slopes that was being proposed by this government, that a minister having that much power, wielding that much power, and making those kinds of decisions will actually end up in a similar type of situation, where a minister may think, okay, well, I consulted with a handful of people, I think this is a good idea, and will actually propose a change in legislation. And because the government has a majority, they can come into this House and actually ram the piece of legislation through as quickly as they want, not taking into consideration any feedback from the opposition. But yet, the real opposition, Madam Chair, are those Albertans out there that do not want these kinds of changes being made in their province. And the members on the other side of the House need to consider that. And it's important that the government be as transparent as possible when it comes to these kinds of decisions. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing a lack of transparency. We're seeing a lack of accountability from this government, making changes that perhaps are beneficial for friends of theirs. For example, the raising of insurance.
Are there others that wish to join the debates on Bill 21? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Decore.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning to you. Hopefully you had a great long weekend and a rest through the constituency break. I know I certainly did. Gave me a little bit more of an opportunity to explore Bill 21, the Red Tape Reductions Statutes Amendment Act. And, you know, as we know, we have a very thick piece of legislation here that is affecting 16 different acts around 9 different ministries, which would be the very definition, of course, of an omnibus bill. Something that members of the government caucus and members of the government bench, when they served very well in opposition, were extremely opposed to. Yet it seems okay now that that we have this type of bill before us. But nevertheless, here it is. And so we're seeing changes to some of the different ministries, or some of the different acts, pardon me. The Animal Health Act, Child Youth Family Enhancement, Cooperatives Act, Education Act, Health Statutes Act, Highways Development and Protection Act, Local Authorities Election Act, Motor Vehicle Accident Claims, Municipal Government Act, Pharmacy and Drug Act, Provincial Parks Act, Public Lands Act, Railway Alberta Act, Residential Tenancies, Rural Utilities and Surveys Act. So those certainly would not fall under one category. And of course, I always have to mention this when I get the chance, because my good friend from Edmonton Millwoods, when she was Labour Minister, brought forward some changes, all within Labour, one ministry, some great changes that I very highly supported, and members opposite, you know, lit their hair on fire because they thought it was just such an omnibus bill. And yet here we have it, and every time I bring this topic up, there's always deafening silence on the other side around this. But nevertheless, I will try to push forward here to talk a little bit here about Bill 21. And so some of the changes that I want to highlight, well, there's many, and I don't think I have enough time with which to bring them up, but I'll certainly try. You know, we're seeing some changes right now around the Animal Health Act, and as we know, there is a cases of avian flu that are currently starting to grow within our province, which is not a good thing, of course. And we are seeing changes around reporting. Not necessarily the length of reporting time, it's just simply being moved from legislation to regulation, which of course signals to me that, you know, moving that, you know, is that considered red tape? I don't know. You're simply shuffling it from one place to another unless you intend to change it, in which case, you know, are you going to be increasing that number, or are you going to be decreasing that number? So it'd be interesting to hear back what the intention is around moving that, what they heard around the reasons they felt that that needed to be moved. I'd also like to bring up some of the changes around the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act. And of course, as we know, Alberta has gone through a very significant challenge this year with the death of children in care. I can't even begin to imagine what family members have been going through with regards to trying to address that within themselves. And so when we're seeing some of the changes around that, you know, again, what is the reasonings for doing that? You know, why would you want to change to remove the 1-year maximum on licenses, both new and renewals? You know, especially during a time that we've just seen over the past 12 months. So I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more from that, and hopefully we'll actually hear from the Minister of Children's Services as to why that was handed down to the red tape minister. The reason I bring that up, because that now takes me to changes around the Education Act. We've very clearly heard one thing being stated by the red tape minister, and then something completely opposite by the education minister. So why did that piece of legislation get handed down to the red tape minister? I mean, if that was the case, you'd think maybe at least some briefing notes had managed to filter their way down. You know, it wasn't like there was just, a little detail that was missed or maybe slightly misinterpreted. They were completely opposite positions. One said there'll be absolutely no more reporting, and then the other one, oh no, there will be reporting. So which one is it? And so why then is the red tape minister legislating on education matters? And I've always had a problem with this. It's supposedly all about making life easier for businesses to be able to operate, to make things faster. So I'm curious around these changes on education, and how will these changes make business move faster? How will this be creating jobs for Albertans here in the province? And so I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the red tape minister some of those statistics that are available around those things. What kind of improvements has this made? Is there a percentage that we can attach onto that? So I guess, as my good friend from Edmonton, Ellerslie, had pointed out, it starts to question this whole notion of transparency, and can we trust the UCP government to work in the best interests of Albertans? And of course, I always will bring people back right to the leader of the UCP, who made a promise way back when to disclose a donor list. And yet we're still waiting for that donor list. So how am I expected to be able to trust this government to do what's right when the leader can't even manage a simple little thing like that, a promise that was made? So, which now, of course, leads me into some of the changes around the Provincial Parks Act. Now, Madam Chair, again, as I'd mentioned, members of the government bench, members of the government caucus who served in the 29th legislature, pretty much any time that they saw any kind of authorities being given to ministers, they very clearly communicated that they were in disagreement with that. And again, as my friend from Edmonton, Ellerslie, very clearly pointed out, that the changes that are being made here with the Provincial Parks and Public Lands Act are significant changes, allowing the minister to make decisions as they see fit. And so I can just imagine what those members would have said back then had the NDP government done something like that. You always hear that notion that, people lighting their hair on fire. I have a feeling they would have lighted their entire bodies on fire when they saw that. And so the reason I'm kind of going down this line of thinking here, my friend from Edmonton Ellerslie managed to kind of get me thinking a little bit. You know, with the whole lack of transparency, and of course that's backed up by, you know, that beautiful title that's been bestowed upon this government as one of the most secretive governments in Canada, which tells me that perhaps transparency isn't quite as transparent, or it's as transparent as mud in this case. And some of the decisions that we've seen the government make over the course of the 30th legislature. You know, we saw the Lougheed Coal Act that was taken out really without any consultation around that. And as we know how that worked out, Albertans pushed back significantly on that. Then comes the little escapade we went through around parks and how they're handled, being potentially sold off and whatnot. And again, we saw that significant pushback from Albertans around that. And so this starts to develop a little bit of a pattern. And so when I'm thinking about the Environment Minister and I guess some of the tirades that we've seen occur, to move that degree of ability to make decisions like what's being proposed in part of Bill 21 around that causes some very significant mistrust and red flags. And so, you know, for me to sit here and try to say, well, you know, I'm just going to have to trust that the minister is going to make the right decisions. I mean, as soon as it seems like there's any kind of significant pushback, you know, the minister's then, quite honestly, you know, trying to then control the narrative. And we've seen that here in the House. Why then wouldn't that translate to the public at large? And so I'm just wondering why then the minister, who, you know, as I know, when served in the 29th legislature, had a significant problem with these types of changes being given to ministers, why he feels that it's okay now. Was it a case of that he didn't actually believe that back then? Or what has changed in the meantime to be able to take that kind of position? Of course, I would also love to hear from others that served during that time and what's changed around that. And so, you know, I don't necessarily have problems with all of Bill 21. I think there's some other changes that are going okay. But because of some of the major concerns I have, as I just mentioned, around parks, and I'm going to take a small bet here that perhaps my friend from Edmonton Gold Bar might have some significant comments around that. Changes and the conflicting messaging around changes to the Education Act, I think, are a problem. And so I'm faced with that. You know, we have some legislation that's fine, some that isn't. They're butting up against each other. I don't think I could support Bill 21 as it's currently written because of those problems. Perhaps maybe we might see some suggestions which to make it a little bit better. And perhaps maybe then I can get to a point of being willing to support it. But I certainly look forward to comments from others, some of the questions I've raised here in this brief time. We are in committee of the whole, so good chance I may be popping back up with more to say based on what I heard. But at this time, I'm looking forward to what others say, Madam Chair.
Are there others to join the debate?
The honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to rise and offer some comments on Bill 21, the Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2022, and I can confirm for my friend from Edmonton Decor that I do have some changes to propose to this bill. The member spoke almost as if he had inside information as to what was going to happen this morning, offering betting advice to people who were paying attention to this morning's proceedings. So I will move this amendment now. I have the appropriate number of copies. And I'll wait for your signal, Madam Chair, to proceed.
Members, this will be known as Amendment A1. Honourable member, please proceed.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd first like to read the amendment into the record. I move that Bill 21, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2022 be amended by striking out Sections 11, Sub 3, and Section 12. And just to remind everybody in the House what Section 11, Sub 3 does, the section amends the Provincial Parks Act to the following: incorporation by reference. A regulation under this act may adopt or incorporate documents that set out standards, directives, practices, codes, guidelines, objectives, or other rules of any government, board, agency, association, or person, including without limitation any standards, directives, practices, codes, guidelines, objectives, or other rules set by the Minister under Section 12.12 relating to any matter in respect of which a regulation may be made under this act. Sub 2, a standard, directive, practice, code, guideline, objective, or other rule may be adopted or incorporated under subsection 1A in whole or in part, and with or without modifications, and B, as it reads on a specific date or as amended or replaced from time to time. And sub 3, when a standard, directive, practice, code, guideline, objective, or other rule is adopted or incorporated under subsection 1, the Minister shall publish it on a public website of the Government of Alberta. The Minister may set standards, directives, practice, codes, guidelines, objectives, or other rules relating to any matter in respect of which a regulation may be made under this Act, and there are similar provisions being proposed to the Public Lands Act. So this amendment, of course, simply strikes out those two sections of the bill that I just read into the record. And there's a very simple reason that that I'm proposing to do this, Madam Chair, and that's because Albertans cannot trust the UCP government to keep its hands off of our provincial parks or public lands and manage them in the public interest. We have these two sections that I read into the record give significant power just to the Minister of Environment and Parks to set any policy document that he likes as a regulation affecting provincial parks or public lands. And this follows along with the terrible track record of this Minister of Environment and Parks. We've already seen him in February of 2020 try to sell off or close down hundreds of provincial parks in the province. We've already seen him assess a random camping fee on public lands where one didn't exist before, driving up the cost of going into our own backyards at any time during the year. We've seen him assess a $90 Kananaskis Country Pass, again, making it more expensive for Albertans to go into their own backyards where previously no cost existed. We've seen the minister arbitrarily try to alter water allocation order on the Old Man River system. We've seen him arbitrarily remove environmental protections during the height of the pandemic in the oil sands area. This minister already has significant discretionary powers that he has used to significantly negatively affect the quality of public land management, parks management, and environmental protections in this province. And the people of Alberta do not trust him to do anything more with our provincial parks and public lands And that's why we are proposing to remove these sections from the bill. Now, I've had a chance to talk to some people with more legal expertise than me regarding what these sections would do. And one of the questions that was posed to them was that, does this mean that any small p policy or document by anybody can be adopted into the regulations, thus creating different regulations in different areas based on what someone wants in the area? The answer is yes. And is it that the minister still has to decide to adopt these, or can government staff, area managers, do the adopting? And this answer from my acquaintance who's a legal expert is quite concerning. The minister needs to sign it, but he has no real obligation to understand it, giving the department a lot of effective power. And then he goes on to say that under section 12.11 sub 2 sub b, the minister can set the regulations so the incorporated document can be amended later without any ministry involvement at any time. So once the minister has adopted a small p policy as a regulation affecting a park or a section of public land, anybody in the department can go ahead and amend it at any time and not make anybody aware of it. This is not the kind of democratic oversight that the people of Alberta expect the government to control or to have over its department. Allowing department officials to change regulations effectively at any time is a remarkable power to give to the department, and one that they should not have. It is widely accepted that the legislature is the place where we set legislation, and orders in council are what govern regulations, and those are the purview of cabinet and only cabinet. Here the minister is turning over this job, taking this job away from cabinet, giving it to himself, and then letting the department officials do whatever they want with it. This should make people extremely uncomfortable. And what is mind-boggling to me, Madam Speaker, is that the party of small government, the party that wants no government control over things like provincial parks or public lands, is effectively relinquishing its control to the public service. Saying, you know what? It's not our job anymore to administer parks and public lands. We're going to let the staff do it, and we're not even going to bother to check in on them or use the powers that are given to us as members of cabinet to run the show. That's not right. It's certainly not consistent with the ideology that the government members purport to hold. And it's certainly not something that the people of Alberta are comfortable with. So, Madam Chair, I think that this amendment will successfully limit the ability of government to overreach in its powers to regulate provincial parks and public lands, and people should vote against it. What's particularly concerning to me, though, Madam Chair, is that this can create an arbitrary set of rules for individual provincial parks or different segments of public land that aren't consistent across the province, and could lead potentially to widespread privatization of our public parks, the encroachment of industrial activities on public parks. You know, I'm dealing right now as the environment critic with a couple of significant issues that are affecting provincial parks here in Alberta right now. One is a threat to the Big Hill Springs Provincial Park near Cochrane. There's a massive gravel pit proposed right on the western boundary of that pit. If this piece of legislation goes forward, the minister actually has it within his power now to carve out a segment of Big Hill Springs Provincial Park as part of the gravel pit. I don't think people of Alberta realize that kind of power is being given to the minister here. So if members opposite vote against this amendment, what they are essentially saying is that they trust the Minister of Environment and Parks to not turn over a provincial park like Big Hill Springs to a gravel pit operator. Dealing with another issue right now, Pigeon Lake. The government is entertaining a proposal to allow a massive feedlot on the shore of Pigeon Lake. The Pigeon Lake Provincial Park is right next door. What's to say if this amendment isn't adopted and this bill goes forward as originally proposed, the Minister of Environment and Parks could allow manure spreading in Pigeon Lake Provincial Park from that feedlot. Is that what government members want? Do they want 36 tons of manure a day being spread in Pigeon Lake Provincial Park? Because that's what this section of the bill would allow. Those are just two examples, Madam Chair. Two realistic threats to our provincial parks that exist right now that could be made much worse if the minister is given this power. And I know that all government members have had an earful from the people of Alberta on the need to better protect provincial parks. Well, here's a tremendous opportunity to show them that they've learned the error of their ways. They should vote in favor of this amendment and stand up for protections of provincial parks like Big Hill Springs and Pigeon Lake. Because at the very least, they don't want those constituency emails and phone calls about why a gravel pit is encroaching on Big Hill Springs Provincial Park, why manure is being spread in Pigeon Lake Provincial Park. They don't want those. Moreover, they shouldn't trust the Minister of the Environment to have this kind of power. So, Madam Speaker, I sincerely hope that the members opposite give serious consideration to this Minister of the Environment's track record on protecting public lands, on protecting provincial parks, more accurately on failing to protect those things, that they understand what's at stake here if this amendment is voted down and the original bill is allowed to go through as is, that we could have significant degradation of our provincial parks and public lands, and they have no power to stop it once this is in place. So for those reasons, Madam Speaker, I urge all members of the House to vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you very much.
Are there others to the amendment? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Thank you. I'd just like to seek unanimous consent of the Chamber to move to 1-minute bells for the remainder of this morning.
Can we do that after? We can't do
I can't.
Well, members, we'll have one 15-minute bell, and then we'll have 1-minute bells.
Thank
Following
you,
that.
Madam Chair.
If I could comply to your wishes, I certainly would, but that will be possible after the
It was a
first
good try. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
bell. The Honourable Minister of Red Tape Reduction.
Thank you. I would just like to speak briefly to the proposed amendment, and not surprisingly, it's the messages being shared by the member opposite are not accurate. Many components, all components of this bill are about making life better for Albertans and enjoying their use of parks. And as it relates to the Provincial Parks Act and Public Lands Act, the changes are going to support an outcome-based approach and development of locally specific rules and guidelines, which addresses concerns about a current one-size-fits-all. We know the members opposite would like to have one-size-fits-all. apply to as many things as possible and have as much control as possible. But this is about moving from a one-size-fits-all to a more location and use-specific rules of Crown lands. And this approach will manage recreational activities in the parks and public lands that can be complicated and confusing. It's good news. It's about moving to an outcome-based approach where we can provide that flexibility while maintaining protection of Crown lands. And it's about a common sense solution, tailoring solutions to the need of a specific area. There would, of course, continue to be public, stakeholder, and Indigenous engagement on regulations, directives, rules, codes, and standards as required. So I will not be supporting this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there others to speak to the amendment? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair. I'm always pleased to rise. And in spite of the minister's, shameful personal attacks on my character, I do want to correct the record on one of the things that she said. She said that the regulations would be put out for public consultation before they're adopted. There is nothing in the bill that does that. There is absolutely no requirement to do any public consultation before any piece of policy is adopted as a regulation. So for the minister to stand here in this place and suggest that that's true needs to be called out. And the people of Alberta need to understand that these changes can be made at any time with no notice and no public consultation whatsoever. I think that's important to get on the record, Madam Speaker, that the Minister of Red Tape Reduction is completely wrong on that fact. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to rise in support of this amendment. Madam Chair, I think first of all, it is distressing to say the least to hear the Minister for the Red Tape Reduction provide the Chamber with some explanation as to the accuracy of what a bill introduced under her name does and does not do. The track record is not great on this topic, certainly with reference to other aspects of this bill when certainly this particular minister had absolutely no idea what this bill in fact does around education. Now, to the substance of her remarks that the bill provides, or this section of the Act provides flexibility and an ability to sort of deviate from a one-size-fits-all approach to parks and public land management. First of all, I find it interesting that the minister has, in fact, in the speaking notes that she read verbatim off her piece of paper, conflated parks and public lands. They are two different management approaches with two different management intents, regardless of which parks designation you're talking about within the public lands or within the Parks Act, or even what kind of public land one is discussing, whether it's in the green zone or elsewhere. Now, there is no question that within the Parks Act, if we want to focus in on that, because I highly doubt that the minister knows this, that permitted uses and activities according to each park designation are already laid out in statute, and those uses and activities are enumerated then with further detail in a park management plan. I'm speaking specifically here under the Parks Act. There are different permitted uses under different classifications within the Parks Act, and then what happens is a park management plan is put out to further provide detail to the public on what is and is not a permitted use, activity, lease, and so on. So oftentimes, because the Parks Act is a very old piece of legislation within the GOA, to my understanding it's one of the oldest pieces of legislation within the GOA, it can be a little bit confusing, which is why the Parks Management Plan is so important. Because in general, for example, in provincial parks, one is not allowed to hunt. However, there is an ability already for the minister to allow for certain seasonal hunting, for example, or for certain wildlife management purposes, and they do that through the Parks Management Plan. The public knows and expects this to be the case because when they put it out in the Parks Management Plan, it is put out to public consult and an even lengthier period of Indigenous consultation. So any of the flexibility and one-size-fits-all little catchphrases that the minister just read off her piece of paper provided to her by other people can be captured with appropriate public consultation within that park management plan. And certainly then operational decisions are made within that rubric by first the Executive Director of Operations within Alberta Parks, and then on down through regional directors and even park rangers, if there were any left, which I am reliably informed that the layoffs have been quite severe and there are fewer and fewer of them all the time. And so there is no need for this change, Madam Chair, unless one wants to introduce more range of permitted activities within the current designation or grant leases that may not be in the public interest or may not conform to appropriate levels of oversight in a way that it makes it opaque to the public that this is happening without changes to the park management plan, without those public consultation period, and without those Indigenous consultations. And I'm just going to put it on the record right now that Indigenous nations will be reviewing any of these changes because they are subject to judicial review under Indigenous consultation. If you start changing land use, purposes, activities, designations without Indigenous consultation, there is an equal and opposite reaction from both treaty organizations and Indigenous and individual Indigenous organizations of various kinds. Now, it seems to me that what we are doing here is putting power into the hands of a minister and a government house leader that, as recently as last week, proved to the public and to this House that he is not trusted by even the majority of his own party members, let alone Albertans. This is a minister that was responsible for the first iteration of pre-pandemic outrage based on his handling of parks and coal mines specifically. His environmental management record sparked absolute outrage, in particular throughout Calgary, and in particular in the riding of Calgary Elbow, where the member has just announced his resignation rather than face the music of the public. And in no small part, when you walk around those streets of that particular seat, you will see no end to parks and coal mining signs now going on 2.5 years of this. This is a source of tremendous shame and electoral peril for this government, for which this environment minister is in large part responsible, given that it was also his job to shepherd legislation through this House, and in so doing has certainly flushed a great deal of his own credibility among his own caucus members, let alone the public. And so, to be asked by this House at this time to entrust that kind of power through this legislation in the hands of that government House leader is a bridge too far. Certainly, we just saw last week, it is a bridge too far for his own party members. It is a bridge too far for a good number of his caucus mates. It is a bridge too far for the Alberta public. And it is certainly, Madam Chair, a bridge too far for sound environmental management in this province, whereby we are protecting nature for future generations and for recreational and other uses in a sustainable way for our children and grandchildren. And so it is for that reason that this amendment should be accepted. This piece of legislation in its current form must be amended to take out this most egregious and vexatious section of it, a piece of the legislation that Albertans do not support, and certainly management of parks and protected areas should be placed in the hands of someone who merits the trust and respect of the people of Alberta. Thank you.
Others to speak to Amendment A1. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's my pleasure to join the debate on the amendment before us. Certainly, I think the important role of the opposition is to, scrutinize any legislation that does come through by government and to make suggestions on improvements. And certainly I know that this amendment brought forward by the member from Edmonton Gold Bar certainly goes a long way to improve Bill 21. So I guess I commend all of the members in this legislature to be in support of it. And really it is, as was already explained by the member previous to me, this is sort of the amendment addresses the most egregious, I think, part of Bill 21, which is, of course, giving the minister significant powers to sort of do what he will. And sadly, and I really do see this as a tragedy, we've seen time and time again that this UCP government is not trustworthy, oftentimes not competent in the decisions that they make. And so when this kind of bold action of giving the minister this significant support, it creates a tremendous concern for me, you know, as an Albertan, let alone a member of this legislature. And I know that certainly when I speak to my constituents or others that I meet with on a regular basis, they too express this very similar concern. So certainly this amendment strikes out sections 11, subsections 3, and section 12 of Bill 21. And I guess the most challenging part of it, certainly for me, is section 12, subsection 2, 1.2, and it says, the minister may set standards, directives, practices, codes, guidelines, objectives, or other rules relating to any matter in respect to of which a regulation may be made under this act. And so that is, you know, that's one part that we would like to amend to actually take that out of the legislation, because that gives sweeping powers to the minister. And so I certainly agree with that. And we know that this seems to be a little bit of a trend by the UCP. I know that the Minister of Seniors and Housing also has a similar clause in the Affordable Housing Act, which gives her tremendous power. She gets to designate what's affordable housing, what's not affordable housing, and without sort of any definition. And oftentimes things are specified more clearly, not in this specific legislation, but in regulations, which we can't see until they are produced. And of course, we know that regulations don't have the power of legislation, and they are easy for the minister to change autonomously, like unilaterally. And certainly, you know, as a believer in strong democracy, this, of course, is a concern that there needs to be checks and balances in politics, and having things brought before the legislature instead of being decided by one person, one cabinet minister even, and not even the executive council. So I think that that is a significant weakness of the legislation, and I would certainly encourage all members of this legislature to vote in support of this amendment, which goes a long way to improving this legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there others to Amendment A1? Seeing none, I will call the question on Amendment A1. It's moved by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That is defeated. A division has been called. Ring the bells. members, division has been called on Amendment A1. All those in favor of the amendment, please stand.
Ms. Sweet, Honourable Member Phillips, Honourable Mr. Sabier, Ms. Goring, Honourable Mr. Agam, Mr. Nielsen, Honourable Ms. Sigurdsson, Member Loyola.
All those opposed, please stand.
The Honourable Mr. Kenny, the Honourable Mr. Schweitzer, the Honourable Mr. Madhu, the Honourable Ms. Schultz, the Honourable Mr. Shandro, the Honourable Mr. Copping, the Honourable Mrs. Savage, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Mr. Taves, the Honourable Minister LaGrange, the Honourable Mr. McIver, the Honourable Mr. Wilson, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Walker, Mr. Amory, the Honourable Mr. Orr, the Honourable Mr. Luan, the Honourable Ms. Plon, the Honourable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Yassin, the Honourable Ms. Furr, Ms. Armstrong-Homenuk, Mr. Yao, Mr. Smith, Mr. Singh, the Honourable Mr. Hunter, Mr. Tour, Mr. Jones, Mr. Jean, Mr. Newdorf, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Williams, Mrs. Fry, Ms. Lovely.
Madam Chair, total for the amendment 8, total against 35.
Honourable members, that has been defeated. We are back. Bill 21, a committee of the whole. Let's get a speaker set up and then members can move freely as they wish. Any speakers to Bill 21 in committee of the whole? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going anywhere by any means. In fact, we've got some amending to do, and you know, it's just a very good reflection of just how these red tape reduction bills are actually just omnibus bills with no rhyme or reason to them. That the Bill 21 also contains, you know, changes to education and the Education Act, right? When we go from parks to education, it's like a, you know, this spinning wheel. It's perhaps a reflection of this government's agenda for the last 3.5 years, taking pot shots at parks and schools and hospitals and whatnot. So anyway, you know, we're always here to try to help, right? The official opposition. And as you might recall, Bill 21, when it was introduced, the Minister of Red Tape Reduction told the media that private schools would no longer have to report on the tuition fees they charged. You also may recall, Madam Chair, that later that same night, the Minister of Education told the public that her colleague was wrong, that private schools would still have to report on the tuition fees that they collect. And so, Madam Chair, my good friend and MLA for Edmonton Glenora has sought to clarity on this issue, you know, in the public interest and to help the government as well. And so I do have an amendment that I would like to move on her behalf. Please. Want me to read that?
This will be known as Amendment A2. Honourable Member, just note that you're moving on behalf of another member. Please proceed.
Okay, well, thank you, Madam Chair. And so you can see that we have this amendment, which is including some new language. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm just getting warmed up, right? You know,
perfect.
Before noon, it takes a few pulls on my chainsaw to get going here. Anyway, so the Honourable Ms. Hoffman to move Bill 21, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Acts, Amendment Section 4.3. In Clause A, adding the following immediately, that the person responsible for the operation of an accredited private school must, within 30 days at the end of each fiscal year, report to the minister the amount of any tuition fees charged to the students during that fiscal year, including all academic and non-academic fees. Also, 3.4, for the purpose of subsection 3, the fiscal year of an accredited private school is September 1st to August 31st. And then 3.5, the minister must publish the information received under subsection 3.3 on the publicly accessible website for the department administered by the minister within 30 days. And then also adding into section 29.4, if the case of an accredited private school, the person responsible for the operation of the accredited private school does not comply with subsection 3.3. And so, Madam Chair, this is a way by which we can, clear up some of the confusion from the government side, and that confusion spread into the public as well, quite frankly. And so, regular folks were very frustrated that they couldn't get clarity from this government as they focused, busy fighting and squabbling with their own internal party matters. And, in the meantime, here we have some of this legislation left hanging. So this amendment, right, thank you very much, the member from Glenora, removes ambiguity, right? And ambiguity is the enemy of reason in this House, Madam Chair. And so, if we can just simply compel accredited schools private schools to submit information to the minister about tuition fees that they charge, that clears the whole issue up. And, quite frankly, I know that private schools are happy to do so on the whole, and certainly I know myself as Minister of K-12 Education that we did work closely supporting private schools to have clarity around tuition and everything else, right? And I have always worked very closely, for example, with the Edmonton Islamic Academy, who are exemplary in their operations of their private religious school. And we should all be very proud of the example that they provide in regards to both clarity and transparency and education as well. If the minister as well, just to make sure we catch the other side, right, is to compel the minister to make that information public online, right? I think everybody deserves to know that. We know that private schools receive quite significant monies, public money, and then anytime we see that, anything that does get public money, then I think we deserve to see what's going on behind that expenditure, right? This government again, has set a trend and a tendency to not do that, right? From anything from the war room to other investments this government makes. It's very hard to see how and where and why that money is being spent. And so, we don't need that in education. It really is not helpful. And, and quite frankly, I believe that this amendment really should be supported by this government as a demonstration that they have no ulterior motives with this particular part of the Red Tape Reduction Act. Because, of course, when it came out at first, it was pure chaos in regards to different ministers saying different things. And so, once again, we're trying to help out here as official opposition. It's trying to set a good example. I mean, if the government happens to be the official opposition next time, this is kind of how you do it, right? Pro tip, look for constructively critical places where you can make legislation better. This amendment does what the Minister of Education said she would do, promised to do verbally. It's always good to put it in writing, I think. And I think that the public will be better served. The government will demonstrate their clarity on this issue, and most importantly, the public interest will be better served as well. So I would encourage all members to support this amendment, and I'm curious to hear from other members in this regard. Thank you.
Are there others to speak to Amendment A2? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my pleasure to rise this morning to speak to the amendment introduced by the member from Edmonton Glenora. And I have to say that I agree with the previous speaker in in wanting to ensure that there's clarity and understanding. We've watched this government create chaos in so many ways, and specifically under this piece of legislation, the Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act, we had the Minister of Red Tape Reduction saying one thing and then the Minister of Education saying another. So when we're looking at ways to help, I think that this piece of legislation could be amended, and it should be supported. We're asking for some clarity, and I think the member from Edmonton-Glenora provides that in the amendment request. It will help reduce confusion, provide some transparency, and I think that when we're looking at ways to make legislation understandable to the public, decreasing chaos is the way to go. And when we hear the discrepancy between the cabinet across the way there, I think that this amendment is a way to decrease that confusion and that chaos. And if it's their intention to be clear, I think that this amendment is simple, it's straightforward, and it should be supported by government if they truly have no ulterior motives and want to be able to support the way that they say that they do. I appreciate that the previous member from Edmonton Northwest mentioned the Edmonton Islamic Academy. That was a school that was in my riding from 2015 to 2019, and I can tell you that they do incredible work in the community. Although they're no longer in Edmonton Castle Downs, many of the staff and the volunteers and the students that attend EIA live in Edmonton Castle Downs. And I've watched over the years that this school provided incredible opportunities for young people that, you know, they're still benefiting from today. They have a culture in that school where once you're involved, you tend to stay involved. And we watch students who've graduated come back and volunteer and provide their experience to the students that are emerging through the academy. And I think that when we're talking about schools within the province of Alberta, we need to be able to provide them with clarity and with understanding, and they should be able to feel that they have a clear understanding of the legislation that is impacting how they do day-to-day business. And I think that the incredible people at Edmonton Islamic Academy deserve to know what's happening within this government and what decisions are being made that have an impact. And you know, I'm a complete supporter of this school and the education and the community building that they do, quite frankly. And I would hope that all members in the chamber want to provide that clarity and understanding to all schools in the province of Alberta. And accepting this amendment is a way to do that. I know that this piece of legislation is quite significant. It has many pieces of legislation that are impacted, all under the statement of red tape reduction. But specifically, when it comes to education, we saw complete chaos happen, where we have a minister responsible for red tape and then a minister responsible for education, giving two completely different messages. And what this would do was it would align what the government is saying their intention is, and it will provide some clarity and perhaps reduce confusion that was created by these two ministers on the same piece of legislation. And I think that, you know, Albertans that I talk to are frustrated with this government and with the chaos and consistent opposing messages that are coming. And this takes a very important piece of legislation and provides that clarity. And it basically says what the Minister of Education promised would happen. And so I see no reason why this government would want to accept this amendment and remove any ambiguity that's caused by their own government and accept the amendment. It's providing some clarity on what the Minister of Education is saying they want to see happen. And I would be very, very curious why any member in this legislation wouldn't want to accept this piece, or this amendment, sorry, and vote in favor of it. I think that by saying yes to this amendment, it's quite simple, it's straightforward, it's doing exactly what the Minister of Education said that they want to do. It would compel the minister to make the information public online and not be shrouded in secrecy, and it would provide an opportunity for transparency to Albertans. And, you know, in our opinion on this side, it should be supported. There should be no reason, unless there's ulterior motives, to support this legislation. It's a way to make what the Minister of Red Tape said and what the Minister of Education is wanting, provides that clarity and that transparency. And I think when it comes to, you know, the role of opposition, we're listening to frustrated Albertans. We're listening to people that just have had enough of the confusion and the chaos. And this is one simple way that I believe that this government could reduce that and support the amendment brought forward by the member from Edmonton-Glenora. And I think that with that, Madam Chair, I would like to conclude my remarks, but I truly hope that everyone in the chamber supports this amendment. Thank you.
Are there others to speak to Amendment A2? The Honourable Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction.
Thank you. I will not be supporting this amendment. It's not surprising that the members opposite continue to fixate on this component of the bill as a distraction from all the amazing good content that was in this bill. The Minister of Education already clarified that independent schools are required to report private sources of revenue, including tuition, to the government, and that that's required as part of the annual audited financial statements. What we are eliminating is one specific additional schedule that independent schools currently submit specific to tuition. So this has been clarified by the Minister of Education, therefore making this amendment unnecessary, and again, just a distraction by the members opposite from all the amazing components of this red tape reduction bill. Thank you.
Are there others to Amendment A2? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I find it interesting to hear the minister stand and say, well, we're saying that there is open transparency and that has to be reported, but we are removing one piece where you know, charter schools don't have to report on tuition. So, in fact, then, there is an openness and transparency because not everything is having to be reported and disclosed, clearly as the minister just indicated, which is why this amendment is so important. Because again, why would the government choose to remove one schedule that does not require the openness and transparency of every financial component of running a school? I don't understand why the government feels the need to do this. What is it about the tuition piece that the government doesn't feel should be reported? We see, and again, I have a Christian school in my riding, and I just went on their website, and everything that could be reported, because they're open and transparent, and they did actually end up going under Edmonton Public Schools. They were an independent school that chose to move into the public system, partly because of the fact that they weren't able to keep up with the tuition schedule that they would need to be able to operate outside of the structure of the public schools. They still have, however, the requirement for the fee schedule when it comes to the Christian program fees, and they also still have school fees. Now, the concern that I have here is that that doesn't necessarily have to be put on every single website. And to not have to disclose what the tuition is for each school, I think should speak to the question around what is going on within this government to ensure that tuition is accessible for all Albertans, to ensure that anybody who would choose to want to go to that school has the financial ability to do that. If that is not publicly reported, there is no accountability to ensure that independent schools are open to all Albertans, because they could potentially create a tuition schedule that becomes so expensive that not every Albertan has the ability to access it. And the whole argument from this government is that these schools should be accessible to all. It's about giving choice, according to the government. But if individuals aren't able to access those schools because the tuition is so high they can't afford to go there, then it's actually not accessible. Which is why all of this needs to be publicly disclosed and reported so that Albertans can make those choices, and that there's also an accountability there to ensure that every school that is being funded through public dollar, supported through public dollar, is accessible and available to all Albertans. And so, again, the minister has been clear, and I'm sure we'll want to hear from the Minister of Education at some point as to clarifying this piece now around the tuition, because clearly what we've heard over the last few weeks from the minister is that everything is open and transparent, everything was supposed to be publicly disclosed, and now again we hear from the minister opposite, the associate minister, saying that, well, everything is disclosed except for the tuition. So again, it's not going to be openly disclosed. So inconsistencies between the Minister of Education, between the Associate Minister of Red Tape, which is why Albertans are concerned and why Albertans don't feel like they can trust this government, because we keep getting inconsistent responses when it comes to the questions that are being asked. So why now is this schedule being changed? Last week, we were being told that nothing was being changed. Everything was going to be open. Everything was going to be transparent. Albertans would be able to see everything. Now, today, we hear that that's actually not the case. And so I think, again, that is why it's so important that this amendment be adopted by the government. Be open. Be transparent. If you're going to help through public dollar to support independent schools, then Albertans have a right to know what those fee schedules look like, including tuition fees. Because tuition is actually one of the biggest barriers that Albertans face when trying to access these schools. So it needs to be open, it needs to be transparent. And if the government chooses not to do that, then what they're saying is that they don't actually believe that these schools should be accessible to all Albertans. Because Albertans should be able to access them through these fee schedules. And so again, I would urge the government to really consider showing Albertans that this is about educational choice, as they say, that this is going to be accessible to all Albertans, that there won't be a financial barrier when it comes to tuition. Accept this amendment and do what they're saying they're doing. And if they choose not to, then once again, they're validating the very concerns that Albertans have, which is they can't trust this government to make sure that they have access to the very services that are being supported through their public dollar. Thank you, Madam Chair.
There are others. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Decor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep my comments very brief. I think my friends from Edmonton Manning, Edmonton Castle Downs have very clearly spoken to why we need to vote in favor of this amendment. You know, I've lectured over and over and over again in this House about language and what's being presented. And so obviously when Bill 21 came forward, the red tape minister believed with her comments that the case was they didn't have to report. Now, she said that the Minister of Education has corrected that. I want to know why it was misinterpreted to begin with. Because if we're allowing the red tape minister to bring forward changes like this, 2 different pieces of legislation, as I'd mentioned, 16 different acts across 9 different ministries, why is that confusion happening? Either the red tape minister is not consulting with the ministers, different ministers, on legislation that is being changed, or it's the other way around. And so again, it's funny how it always comes down to the language. What's being said, what isn't being said, and more importantly, what are you saying about it? And there was obviously a conflict there. This amendment that's brought forward from my friend from Edmonton, Glenora, and the critic for education clears that language up so there's no misinterpretation about it. Again, it's not about us. We know what's now happening in the debate. But if somebody else isn't able to check, for whatever reason, isn't able to ask any one of us what went on during this discussion, this is how confusion begins. And I've persistently and consistently seen that from the UCP government, bringing this forward. So I would sincerely hope that members opposite will reconsider voting in favor of this amendment. This will clear up the language. There won't be any kind of misunderstandings going forward. There won't be any need for a minister to correct another minister. Hopefully that practice would then even continue going forward. But then at the very least, maybe one of these ministers would like to stand up here in committee of the whole and explain to us who's not talking to the other. So I'm very much in support of this amendment going forward. And I think we need to continue this kind of practice to clear up these constant misunderstandings that we've seen with regards to pieces of legislation that are being handed down to the red tape ministry, obviously in some effort to try to justify the $10 to $15 million that's being spent on this associate ministry over the course of this legislature. Albertans need to know that they can trust the decisions that are being made, because clearly right now that trust is almost gone. So I'll conclude my remarks there, and we'll see if maybe perhaps we get an answer from one of my questions.
Are there others to speak to Amendment A2? Seeing none, I will call the question on Amendment A2 as moved by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest on behalf of the Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. That is defeated. A division has been called. Ring the bells. Honourable members, a division has been called on Amendment A2 on Bill 21. All those in favour of the amendment, please stand.
Ms. Sweet, Honourable Member Phillips, Honourable Mr. Sabir, Ms. Goring, Honourable Mr. Egan, Mr. Nielsen, Member Loyola.
All those opposed, please stand.
The Honourable Mr. Madhu, the Honourable Ms. Schultz, the Honourable Mr. Shandro, the Honourable Mr. Copping, the Honourable Mrs. Savage, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Minister LaGrange, the Honourable Mr. McIver, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Walker, Mr. Amory, the Honourable Mr. Orr, the Honourable Mr. Luan, the Honourable Ms. Pond, the Honourable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Yassine, the Honourable Ms. Furr, Ms. Armstrong-Homenuk, Mr. Yao, Mr. Smith, Mr. Singh, the Honourable Mr. Hunter, Mr. Tour, Mr. Jones, Mr. Jean, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Newdorf, Mr. Barnes, Mr. Lowen, Mrs. Fry, Mr. Williams, Ms. Lovely.
Madam Chair, total for the amendment 7, total against 33.
Honourable members, that amendment has been defeated. Are there others to speak to Bill 21? The Honourable Member for Calgary, Bular-McCall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to speak briefly to this bill. I do understand that this bill have changes which are mostly of administrative nature, and we can support those changes, but this bill also contains very controversial changes that we cannot support, that Albertans don't support. For instance, this bill gives Minister of Environment and Parks broad powers to set standards, directive, practices, codes, guidelines, or other rule relating to any matter in respect of which a regulation can be made under this Act. That's huge, huge power, and in legal terms, if we interpret that, that means the minister can do anything he wants. So that's not okay with us. That's not okay with Albertan. Nobody trusts this caretaker government with over-cherished provincial parks. And second thing is that they are also making changes how private schools report public funds. I think Albertans deserve to know how their funds are spent, how their tax dollars are spent, and this bill will water down that transparency. No wonder this government got an award in secrecy and transparency because of the changes like this. And it is for that reason, primarily these two changes. These are not acceptable to us. These are not acceptable to Albertans. And that's why we cannot support this piece of legislation. Now, thank you, Madam Chair. I will take my seat.
Are there others to speak? Seeing none, I will call the question. On Bill 21, the Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2022, on the clauses of the bill, are you agreed? Agreed. Any opposed? Carried. On title and preamble, are you agreed? Oh, my apologies. A division has been called. Ring the bells. Thank you. Clauses. members, the division has been called on the clauses of Bill 21. All those in favor, please stand.
The Honourable Mr. Madhu, the Honourable Ms. Schultz, the Honourable Mr. Shandro, the Honourable Mr. Copping, the Honourable Mrs. Savage, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Minister Lagrange, the Honourable Mr. McIver, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Walker, the Honourable Mr. Orr, the Honourable Mr. Luan, the Honourable Ms. Pond, the Honourable Ms. Isaac, Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Yassin, the Honourable Ms. Fur, Ms. Armstrong-Homenuk, Mr. Yao, Mr. Smith, Mr. Singh, the Honourable Mr. Hunter, Mr. Tour, Mr. Jones, Mr. Jean, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Newdorf, Mr. Barnes, Mr. Lowen, Mrs. Fry, Mr. Williams, Ms. Lovely.
Any opposed, please stand.
Ms. Sweet, the Honourable Member Phillips, the Honourable Mr. Sabier, Ms. Goring, the Honourable Mr. Egan, Mr. Nielsen, Member Loyola.
Madam Chair, total for the motion 32, total against 7.
Honourable members, that is carried. Moving on title and preamble, are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we rise and report Bill 21.
Motion. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. The Honourable Member for Brooks Medicine Hat.
Madam Speaker, the Committee of the Whole has had under consideration a certain bill. The committee reports the following bill, Bill 21. Madam Speaker, I wish to table copies of all amendments considered by Committee of the Whole on this date for the official records of the Assembly.
Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I see that the clock is on or nearing 12 o'clock, and at that, I move that the Assembly be adjourned until 1:30 p.m. today.
Having heard that motion, all those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. Carried. House stands adjourned until 1:30 this afternoon.